March 18, 1944. As the skies over Europe remained a battlefield, a new, unsettling front was emerging for Allied airmen who sought refuge in neutral territory. For decades, Switzerland symbolized a beacon of hope and humanitarian neutrality, a safe haven in a war-torn continent. But the truth, as revealed by the experiences of American airmen, was far more complex and often deeply antagonistic. The prevailing wisdom that Switzerland was a benevolent host was largely a myth. Its neutrality was profoundly influenced by a desperate economic vulnerability and a pervasive pro-Nazi sentiment among its elite. By 1942, an astonishing 97% of Swiss exports went to the Axis powers or their collaborators. Figures like Marcel Eduard Pilet-Gollers, then president of the Swiss Federal Council, and influential industrialists such as Walter Stampfli, who organized Swiss production for Nazi Germany, ensured strong economic ties. Emil Burli, a known Hitler sympathizer, headed the Oerlikon works, producing anti-aircraft cannons for the Luftwaffe. Even Dr. de Buller, Max Huber, president of the International Red Cross, owned armaments factories in Germany that employed slave labor. And Dr. Thor, Heinrich Rothmund, Swiss Minister of Justice and Police, once infamously suggested stamping Jewish passports with a red J. This environment meant appeasing Germany often took precedence over humanitarian principles for Allied personnel. When Lieutenant Presidents George D. did Seif without Telford's B-24, Hell's Kitchen, landed in Switzerland along with 15 other American bombers on March 18, 1944. Its flight engineer, Daniel Culler, a pacifist-turned-soldier, attempted to sabotage the aircraft. He desperately sought to prevent its advanced technology from falling into German hands even indirectly. This act vividly illustrates the underlying distrust of Swiss intentions. Initial Allied perceptions of Switzerland as a safe haven were quickly shattered. Over 1,000 American flyers were in Swiss hands by the end of summer 1944. The Swiss government classified these airmen as internees rather than prisoners of war. This seemingly legalistic distinction allowed Switzerland to deny them rights granted under the Geneva Accords, facilitating harsher treatment. They were subjected to severe punishments for even minor infractions and denied basic POW entitlements. By the end of the war, over 1,740 American airmen were held in Switzerland. The U.S. Army Air Forces Commander General Hap Arnold grew suspicious. He feared that some airmen might be deliberately landing in neutral countries to avoid combat. Allied Air Force leaders like Karl Spaatz and Ira Eaker defended the courage of their crews, but the damage was done. Brigadier General Barnwell Rhett, Legge, the U.S. was too. Military attaché in Bern prioritized appeasing the Swiss. He actively discouraged escape attempts and downplayed the plight of American internees, even as other reports emerged. The disparity in treatment between Switzerland and Sweden became glaring. In Sweden, internees enjoyed greater liberties, received better care, and saw more efforts for repatriation. In stark contrast, the high rate of escape attempts from Swiss camps, 947 out of 1,740, American airmen tried to break out, fundamentally challenged the narrative of benevolent hosts. These were not men seeking comfort. They were desperate to return to combat, a desire born of poor conditions and restrictive policies. This darker aspect of Swiss neutrality was further underscored by tragic events. On April 1, 1944, 20 B-24, liberators mistakenly bombed Schaffhausen, killing 40 civilians. Later, it was documented that at least 20 RAF and 16 American airmen were killed by Swiss forces during the war. It was a complex reality. Swiss neutrality was not a pure humanitarian stance, but a strategic balancing act heavily influenced by economic interests and a complex internal political landscape. It was a hidden dimension of the war, where a neutral nation, through its policies, contributed to the suffering of those fleeing conflict. For some American airmen, the journey from the sky to internment would lead to a place far worse than any prison camp envisioned by the Geneva Conventions. It was a place called Wauwelamoose, described by internee James Mizoraka as more like a concentration camp. Wauwelamoose was a closely packed compound of mud-splattered barracks surrounded by high barbed wire fences and patrolled by guards with machine guns and attack dogs. Here, Lieutenant Colonel Legge's warnings about punishment took on a chilling new meaning. The commandant, Captain André Henry Begin was a man already under investigation by Swiss authorities for a litany of charges, including adultery, bribery, embezzlement of prison funds, spying for the Germans, and unlawfully wearing a Nazi uniform. Daniel Culler, the flight engineer from Hell's Kitchen, found himself repeatedly confined to Warwiller Mews. He described the barracks as filthy with straw, which prisoners used for both bedding and toilet paper before vacating in miasmic slit trenches just outside the front door. Despite Red Cross reports that found no abuse, Culler's own court transcript, written in German, omitted any mention of his testimony regarding rape and prison conditions. His final bill from the Swiss authorities, 18 francs for the court's time and trouble. General Legge, despite knowing of Warwiller Mews' existence, maintained an official position that if an American airman tried to escape, he should be subject to Swiss punishment. A bulletin was issued, warning that anyone attempting to escape will receive no support from me against punitive action by the Swiss internment authorities, which will be 5 to 6 months detention at Camp Warwiller Mews. This policy effectively abandoned American airmen to brutal and inhumane conditions. However, not all Allied officials adhered to this cruel directive. Lieutenant Telford, for example, orchestrated his crew's escape with paid Swiss operatives. A clandestine OSS underground network began to operate, hiding flyers in the American legation in Bern, then transporting them via boxcars or ferrying them across Lake Geneva. Sam Woods, the American consul general in Zurich, established his own escape network, personally helping over 200 natures. He used false passports and drove them to the frontier in his black sedan, funded by cash channeled through IBM's European office, courtesy of its founder, Thomas J. Watson. These defiant acts ultimately saved numerous airmen, demonstrating agency and compassion outside of official and often failed directives. Meanwhile, as the plight of internees unfolded, the war in the air was far from settled. The myth of absolute Allied air superiority, especially in late 1944, was being brutally challenged by German industrial ingenuity and desperate new tactics. Allied intelligence had underestimated Germany's capacity for technological advancement. On September 11 and 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force suffered 75 bombers lost in just 2 days. This was the devastating impact of the Luftwaffe's new storm groups. These Sturmbock or battering ram units comprised 8-ton flying tanks, heavily armored Focke-Wulf Fly-1190s with enhanced armor plating, bullet-resistant canopies, auxiliary fuel tanks, and 5 fearsome guns. They attacked in waves of up to 40 planes, hitting from the rear, wingtip to wingtip, holding fire until within 100 yards. German pilots were bound by a solemn oath to ram a bomber if they failed to score a direct hit. The ultimate demonstration of this ferocious tactic came on September 27, 1944, when 25 four-engine bombers of the 445th Bomb Group were destroyed in 6 minutes of focused fury. Only 4 liberators made it back to Tibbenham. Pilot Heinz Papenburg, who rammed an American bomber, recalled his left wing soaring through the bomber's rudder. His own wing was so damaged it couldn't hold the plane in the air. Compounding this immediate threat was the spectre of Germany's technological leap, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first combat-tested jet fighter. It flew at 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. Crucially, it ran on diesel fuel, which Germany possessed in far greater quantity than standard aviation fuel. This aircraft represented a significant future threat that Allied air forces were ill-prepared to counter. However, even with such innovation, human courage remained paramount. Future test pilot Chuck Yeager, flying a P-51 Mustang, famously destroyed 5 Me-109s over Bremen on October 12, becoming an ace in a day. His bravery and defiance of regulations which he took up the chain of command to General Eisenhower himself symbolized the fighting spirit against a desperate, yet still dangerous, enemy. Despite the formidable threat posed by new German tactics and technology, Germany's defeat was ultimately accelerated by a combination of factors, crippling Allied strategic bombing and critical self-inflicted errors in German war production and leadership. The potential of the Me-262, for instance, was largely squandered by Adolf Hitler himself. In late 1943 and early 1944, Hitler insisted on converting the Me-262 from a desperately needed fighter into a bomber. This decision, against the advice of his air advisors, including production chief Erhard Milch, signaled a fundamental misallocation of a critical technological advantage. By May 1944, Hitler discovered that fighter development had continued in secret. In an enraged outburst, he dismissed Milch and transferred aircraft production to Albert Speer. Then, in August 1944, Hitler demanded the cessation of all aircraft production and a complete shift to anti-aircraft flak guns. Though partially rescinded, these erratic decisions revealed a deep strategic disorientation and a profound failure to grasp the importance of air defense. They also highlight the complex interplay of factors beyond Hitler's madness that hampered German innovation. It became clear that the true war-winning strategy would not be the defeat of a single weapon, but the methodical destruction of the logistical and energy underpinnings of the German war machine. In September 1944, Allied bombing strategy shifted to prioritize transportation targets, railways and canals alongside oil production. This was a decisive blow. Germany's vast railway system could not compensate for the disruptions in water transport, leading to a cascading economic collapse. This approach, as former head of a German war production board, General George Thomas, would later succinctly state, "Victory is production, and you destroyed German production. Victory is movement, you paralyzed us." However, this strategic bombing campaign came at immense human cost. Psychiatrists with the 8th Air Force noted the guilt many airmen felt over killing remote, almost abstract victims. Radio operator J. Operator J. Dabichi J. Lynch wrote in his combat diary, "We live with fear, but not with a consuming hatred for another human." Pilot Bernard Thomas Nolan recalled, "The spectre of the extermination of innocents would forever lie in the back of my mind." The reality of late 1944 bombing was that approximately 80% of the 8th and 70% of the 15th's missions were conducted in dense to moderate cloud cover, relying on the H-2X scope as a targeting aid. This meant more blind bombing and increased civilian risk. In November 1944, a new directive, pressed by General George Marshall on General Doolittle, allowed for the bombing of targets of last resort. This was a clear departure from the 8th Air Force's standing policy against indiscriminate bombing. In December 1944, Hitler launched his colossal gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. This surprise offensive, spearheaded by Colonel Joachim Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Division, relied on surprise bad weather and the capture of Allied fuel to split Allied forces and negotiate a separate peace. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's order of the day spoke of a decisive counterattack. Initially, the attack created a ghost front, manned by untested units fighting in 0-degree temperatures. But the skies eventually cleared over the Ardennes. Allied air power then proved decisive, crippling German logistics and destroying irreplaceable assets. General Lawton Collins led the column that pilloried Manteufel's division. General Omar Bradley would later confirm the lack of gasoline was a direct factor in German surrender of materiel. On New Year's Day, the Stiege to some of the pros and German surrender of materiel. 1945, the Luftwaffe launched its final major offensive Operation Baseplate. Over 800 German pilots targeted Allied fighter fields. They destroyed or damaged over 450 planes. But the cost was catastrophic for Germany. Over 400 piston-engine aircraft and 237 pilots lost. It was, for the Luftwaffe, its greatest single catastrophe, hastening its irreparable decline. Amidst these final brutal spasms of the war, on December 15, 1944, the legendary bandleader Glenn Miller disappeared. His music from Moonlight Serenade to Chattanooga Choo Choo had become the soundtrack of morale for Allied troops. Requested by General Eisenhower, Miller's band played in hangars to music-hungry airmen. His plane, lost over the English Channel, was a poignant reminder that in the unforgiving skies of war, danger was omnipresent, affecting even those who brought comfort to others. The bombing of railway transportation systems in the Cologne and Frankfurt areas created railway deserts, confirming that the methodical destruction of Germany's logistical and energy infrastructure was indeed the war-winning strategy. The final year of World War II in Europe was far from a foregone conclusion. In January 1945, a period known as the January Crisis, Allied air leaders, including General Karl Spaatz and General Hap, Arnold, expressed profound pessimism. Lacking a full picture of the damage already inflicted, they feared a prolonged and costly war. Assistant Secretary of War Robert Lovett described the prevailing despondency. This crisis of confidence was largely due to an initial overemphasis by the Combined Strategic Targets Committee on oil production at the expense of transportation infrastructure bombing. Persistent cloud cover in late 1944 and early 1945 had obscured the true extent of Allied bombing damage. It was only through Sir Norman Bottomley's review of UL intercepts that the true extent of the parlous state of the German economy began to emerge. Adding to this anxiety was the credible threat of advanced German technology. Brigadier General George C. M. MacDonald, 8th Air Force Intelligence Chief, warned of a German jet program capable of producing approaching 700 jet fighters if the war continued beyond June 1945. Admiral A.V.V. Alexander, First Lord of the Admiralty, described the threat of new U-boats, fast, silent-running submarines with supplemental electric motors, allowing up to 72 hours submerged. By January 1945, almost 100 new boats were under construction, with 36 already in training exercises in the Baltic Sea. Such capabilities threatened losses on a level suffered in spring 1943. General Frederick Anderson even advocated replanning the strategic air offensive, assuming a longer war. However, the course of the war was about to be decisively altered. On January 12, 1945, Stalin unleashed the Red Army's final winter offensive. This massive Soviet push began to shatter German defenses and liberate occupied territories, directly impacting Allied strategic thinking and the fate of 95,000 Americans among the POWs in camps, including over 30,000 airmen. Driven by desperation and anger at the relentless Allied bombing, Adolf Hitler himself escalated the brutality. On March 15, 1945, he issued a blanket command for all downed Terrorflieger, his term for Allied airmen, to be shot or lynched. This direct order from Hitler's private secretary, Martin Bormann, to execute Allied airmen reflected a Nazi propaganda campaign that had branded Allied airmen as murderers. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels declared an eye for an eye policy. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Hitler's security police chief, encouraged pogroms against airmen, which led to 66 legally documented incidents of killings or beatings of unarmed American airmen in German custody, over 70% of which were murder. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff, Wehrmacht, would later testify about delaying tactics to block Hitler's lynch justice orders. Lieutenant Louis Loewski, a B-24 navigator, whose bomber, Terry and the Pirates, collided with another B-24, the Brand, over bomb-blasted Berlin on March 22, 1944, recounted his harrowing experience. After parachuting into the city, he faced immediate civilian hostility. Fearful of his dog tags, marked with an H for Hebrew, Loewski worried about being lynched, calling it a necktie party. His personal fear, amidst the chaos of a city under constant bombardment, underscores the barbaric lengths to which the Nazi regime would go. After capture, Loewski found himself at Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe interrogation center at Obersoll. Here, a different form of warfare was waged. Held in an unheated cell colder than a Nazi's heart, and fed stale black bread and evil-tasting ersatz, coffee, Loewski endured solitary confinement. The master interrogator, Hans Scharf, was renowned for his subtle methods. Scharf questioned over 500 airmen and claimed remarkable success in extracting useful information. He eschewed brutal tactics, instead employing psychological ploys, offering chocolate and cigarettes or startling officers with intimate details, such as their recent stay in a specific room at the Grosvenor House in London with an attractive blonde woman. German intelligence mined information from seemingly innocent sources, like stars and stripes, and even from the impression made by a rough board on a PODB's ration card, revealing the specific bomb group the airmen belonged to. This methodical approach revealed the crucial role of intelligence and psychological warfare in the late stages of the war. For those who survived the harrowing experience of being shot down and captured, a new and prolonged mission began. Life as a prisoner of war. The common phrase, "For you the war is over," rang hollow for many. As B-24 navigator Lulevsky recalled, "It was the beginning of our longest mission. By war's end, approximately 33,000 Army Air Forces personnel were in German prison camps, part of the over 93,000 Americans captured or interned in the European theater. German power camps, especially the specialized Luft camps run by the Luftwaffe, were designed as high-security facilities. They were intended not merely to hold prisoners, but to break them. However, they inadvertently fostered remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and a powerful sense of community." Halmos, a B-24 navigator and pre-war writer, described the profound psychological shock of capture, the feeling of having passed through a door into an alien world. Yet, in this alien world, a unique culture of resistance and survival began to emerge. Stalag Luft 3 in Sagan opened on April 1, 1942, as a small, high-security RAF camp, eventually housed over 10,000 prisoners by late 1944, more than half of them American flyers. Despite the formidable security goon boxes, sentry towers, with powerful searchlights, concertina wire, and fences patrolled by ferrets, English-speaking guards with metal probes for tunnel detection, and attack dogs, Alsatians trained on Allied uniforms, prisoners relentlessly sought escape. Colonel Dar Alkir, the senior American officer in charge of a compound, established a military-style command, creating a semblance of order and self-governance. Legendary figures like Gail Cleven and John Egan became symbols of this resistance. The Great Escape of March 24–25, 1944 epitomized this spirit. 76 RAF prisoners attempted to tunnel out. This pivotal event showcased the prisoners' incredible capabilities. But Hitler's response was brutal. On April 6, 1944, the senior British officer was informed of the shooting of 41, later 50, of the escapees. This execution transformed escapes from a calculated risk into a deadly gamble. It instilled widespread shock and despair, hardening German control, yet simultaneously galvanizing prisoner resolve. The threat of even greater brutality loomed later in the war. On September 30, 1944, Martin Bormann ordered the transfer of all Paudi camp control to the SS. This move, effectively delegating Paudi matters to SS Obergruppenführer Gottlob Berger, created a constant, terrifying underlying threat of being sent to concentration camps. 168 Allied flyers, betrayed in France in summer 1944, were indeed sent to Buchenwald before their eventual transfer to Sagan. In December 1944, POWs at Sagan learned of the concentration camps, a stark contrast to any romanticized notions of warfare. However, Berger, perhaps sensing the war's turning tide, chose a path of more humane treatment, possibly as a measure of self-preservation. Remarkably, Brigadier General Arthur W. Vanneman, the highest-ranking Air Force officer captured, carried the secret of ultra-intelligence. He maintained extreme mental discipline, successfully concealing this vital information throughout his captivity. While some camps adhered to a semblance of Geneva Conventions, others, like Stalag Luft 4, were characterized by severe deprivation and systematic cruelty. Lieutenant Colonel Aribert Bombach, a strident Nazi commander who had lost his family in an Allied bombing raid, may have used the camp for a personal vendetta. Stalag Luft 4 was plagued by overcrowding, filth, parasitic sand fleas, and starvation rations. Daily calorie intake was typically 1,500 to 1,900 calories, far below the 3,000 required for active life. Medical services were medieval. The Heidekrug Run in the summer of 1944 exemplifies this deliberate cruelty. Nearly 2,000 Anglo-American flyers were transferred to Stalag Luft 4. Capt. Walter Pickhardt, a camp guard renowned for brutality, incited guards and naval cadets to savagely attack prisoners during a 2-mile forced march. Prisoners were stabbed with bayonets, hit with rifle butts, and attacked by dogs, often while handcuffed. John W. Carson, a prisoner who endured this Baltic nightmare, clung to a ship's ladder for 2 days, motivated to survive by the thought of his twin brother's potential return. Sergeant Richard H. That, Hoffman recalled the lack of artificial limbs for wounded men, and the trauma of hearing horrific injuries that never fully healed. The mental toll was immense. Barbed wire disease and captivity psychosis became documented psychological ailments. Francis Budgerald, a Fortress pilot, described the camp's wire in his diary as a stern tyrant. The feeling of losing one's identity and the despair of impatient maidens, a collection of Dear John letters from jilted fiancé sires, highlighted the emotional toll. A bombardier's suicidal rush for the wire, ending with a gunshot and dog attack, was a stark illustration of the ultimate depths of despair. Yet, amidst this deprivation, the human spirit found ways to thrive. Prisoners fostered immense solidarity, creating combines for resource sharing. They established colleges where they taught each other, using meager resources. Nicholas Katzenbach, a navigator and future U.S. Attorney General, used the camp libraries for disciplined study, allowing him to skip undergraduate years after the war. Clandestine radios, built with primitive Metox receivers and nails acting as antenna terminals, brought news from the outside world. Underground newspapers, with multiple copies made by smoking paper over tin can lamps to create carbon paper, were distributed. Even toilet paper was used for news and musical notation. Ingenuity was boundless. Homemade homebrew from raisins, prunes, and sugar, rubber stamps fashioned from shoe heels for forgeries, miniature compasses from needles, razor blades and glass, and German uniforms dyed grey from boiled bookbindings for escape attempts. Despite the harsh realities, the goon bread with sawdust, the blutwurst, blood sausage, and the maggots in barley soup prisoners found ways to assert their humanity. They meticulously constructed a camp Christmas tree from scraps of paper, wire, and soap wrappers. On Christmas Day, witnessing German families through the fence only amplified their own separation and loss. As the fall of 1944 gave way to winter, a new wave of uncertainty and declining hope washed over the camps. News of the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes in December fueled despair. But on New Year's Day, 1945, the BBC announced the Red Army's imminent offensive across western Poland. This sparked a renewed anticipation of liberation. The Power W experience was a crucible of suffering, but it also forged deep psychological bonds and instilled profound lessons in resilience, cooperation, and human connection. For these airmen, the war was indeed their longest mission, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of extreme degradation.